GhastlyGarlic Episode 43. Ghost Festival, The Haunting on the Fourth Floor. Prologue, The Fourth Floor. Hong Kong is a city that never sleeps, a metropolis where ancient traditions collide with modernity. Yet, beneath its neon lights and bustling streets, there exists a world shrouded in shadows, a realm where the past clings to the present, refusing to let go. This is the Hong Kong of ghost stories, a place where the living and the dead share the same space, if only for a time. In the heart of the city, on the edges of its skyscrapers and alleyways, lies an old residential building. It stands tall, unnoticed among the newer constructions, its worn facade a testament to the passage of time. The building has seen generations of tenants come and go, yet it holds onto its secrets tightly. Among those who know, it's said that the fourth floor of this building is cursed. Few speak of it, and fewer still dare to live there. Those who have stayed long enough tell tales of ghostly encounters, of shadows lurking in the corners, and of doors that open and close by themselves. But these stories are not merely idle chatter. They are a warning, a whisper in the wind to those who are willing to listen. For in this city, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, there are things that go bump in the night, things that hunger for more than just offerings. And as the Ghost Festival, also known as, approaches, the veil between worlds grows thinner, allowing spirits to cross over into the realm of the living. This is a tale of such a crossing, of the horrors that lurk within the shadows of the fourth floor, and of those who dare to uncover its secrets. But be warned, not all stories have a happy ending, and some truths are better left buried in the past. Chapter 1, The Arrival. Rachel Wong stood at the entrance of her new home, a modest apartment in an aging building on the outskirts of Kowloon. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but as a struggling freelance photographer, she couldn't afford to be picky. She had moved to Hong Kong from Vancouver, hoping to reconnect with her roots while pursuing her career. The city had always fascinated her, the blend of old and new, the relentless energy that seemed to pulse through its streets. But as she stared at the dimly lit hallway leading to her apartment on the fourth floor, a sense of unease crept over her. The elevator ride up had been unsettling. The old machine creaked and groaned as it ascended, the lights flickering as if struggling to stay on. The building itself was a relic from another time, with narrow corridors, peeling paint, and a musty smell that seemed to linger no matter how many windows were opened. But it wasn't the state of the building that bothered Rachel. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Just nerves, she muttered to herself, shaking off the feeling as she pushed open the door to her apartment. It was small but cozy, with a view of the street below. The furniture was sparse, just a bed, a couch, and a small table, but it was enough for her needs. She had always preferred simplicity, believing that clutter only distracted from the essence of life. As she began unpacking her things, Rachel noticed a small shrine in the corner of the living room. It was a simple setup, an incense holder, a few offerings of fruit, and a small statue of a deity she didn't recognize. The previous tenant must have left it behind, she thought. She wasn't particularly religious, but she had grown up in a family that respected the old ways, so she decided to leave the shrine as it was. It felt wrong to disturb it. That night, as Rachel lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional sound of traffic from the street below, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. She told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the newness of her surroundings. Yet, as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice calling her name. Chapter 2, The Festival of Ghosts. The week of Ghost Festival arrived with the oppressive heat of a Hong Kong summer. The streets were filled with the sights and sounds of the festival, stalls selling paper offerings, families preparing feasts for the spirits, and the smell of incense thick in the air. Rachel had heard of the Ghost Festival before, but experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. It was as if the entire city had been transformed, the vibrant energy she had always associated with Hong Kong replaced by a somber, eerie atmosphere. Despite the festivities, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her since moving into the apartment. The unease that had greeted her on the first day had only grown stronger. She had started hearing strange noises at night, the creaking of floorboards, the rustle of paper, and occasionally, the sound of someone, or something, whispering just outside her door. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. One evening, as she was walking home, Rachel noticed a group of people gathered around a small fire on the street. They were burning paper offerings, the flames casting long, flickering shadows on the pavement. She watched as they carefully folded the papers into intricate shapes before tossing them into the fire. It was a ritual she had seen many times as a child, but witnessing it now, in the context of her current situation, sent a chill down her spine. "Are you okay?" A voice broke through her thoughts. Rachel turned to see an older woman standing beside her. She was small and frail-looking, with a kind face that was lined with age. "You look troubled," the woman said, her voice gentle. Rachel forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. It's been a long week." The woman nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Rachel. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, I just moved in a few days ago," Rachel replied. The woman's expression grew serious. "Be careful during the festival," she said. "This is a time when the spirits walk among us. They are hungry and restless. If you're not careful, they might latch onto you." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" The woman glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "There are places in this city where the spirits are stronger, where the veil between our world and theirs is thin. Your building, it has a history. Many souls have passed through there, some of them not so peacefully." Rachel's heart began to race. "What kind of history?" The woman hesitated before answering. "During the war, many people died in that building. Some say their spirits never left. Others say the building was cursed long before that it was built on land where terrible things happened." Rachel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but there was something about the woman's tone that made her believe every word. "If you hear anything strange, or if you feel like something is watching you, don't ignore it," the woman continued. "And whatever you do, don't invite them in." With that, the woman turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing alone in the dim light of the street lamps. She wanted to dismiss the woman's words as nonsense, but she couldn't. Not after everything that had happened since she moved in. That night, as Rachel lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, more insistent. She could hear her name being called, over and over, in a voice that was not her own. She pulled the covers over her head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers seemed to come from inside her mind, echoing in the darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on her door. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, praying that it was just her imagination, but the knock came again, louder this time. She got out of bed, her legs shaking, and slowly made her way to the door. She pressed her ear against it, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling, but just as she was about to turn it, she remembered the woman's warning, "Don't invite them in." Rachel yanked her hand back, as if the doorknob had burned her. She took a step away from the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking continued, more frantic now, as if whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the apartment remained quiet. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. What was happening to her? Was she losing her mind? Or was there something truly sinister at play? She didn't know what to believe anymore. All she knew was that she was terrified, and the festival was far from over. Chapter 3, The Shrine. The next day, Rachel couldn't shake the events of the previous night from her mind. She tried to go about her daily routine, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She avoided the 4th floor as much as possible, opting to take the stairs instead of the elevator, even though it meant a longer climb. She didn't want to be alone in that confined space, not after what had happened. As she ascended the stairs, she couldn't help but notice how quiet the building was. There were no sounds of other tenants, no children playing in the hallways, no neighbors chatting. It was as if the entire building had been abandoned, leaving her as the only occupant. When she reached her apartment, she hesitated before opening the door. The memory of the knocking was still fresh in her mind, and she was afraid of what she might find inside. But the hallway was empty, and the door was locked, just as she had left it. She unlocked it and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but the sense of unease remained. Rachel's gaze fell on the shrine in the corner of the living room. The offerings had been untouched, and the incense holder was empty. She had never paid much attention to the shrine before, but now it seemed to draw her in, as if it held the answers to the strange occurrences in her apartment. She knelt before the shrine, examining the statue closely. It was an old figure, its features worn from years of exposure to the elements. The deity's face was serene, but there was something about its eyes that unsettled her. They seemed to follow her, watching her every move. Without thinking, Rachel reached out and touched the statue. The moment her fingers made contact with the cold stone, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, and she recoiled in shock. The room around her seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in on her as the air grew thick with the smell of incense. She heard a voice, low and menacing, whispering in her ear, but she couldn't make out the words. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, and she backed away from the shrine, her heart racing. Rachel's mind was in turmoil. She didn't know what to believe anymore. The rational part of her wanted to dismiss everything as a coincidence, a product of stress and lack of sleep. But the other part, the part that had grown up hearing ghost stories and superstitions, knew that something was wrong. She needed answers, but she didn't know where to find them. The woman from the festival had mentioned that the building had a history, that terrible things had happened there. Rachel decided to investigate further, hoping that learning more about the building's past might help her understand what was happening. She spent the next few days researching the history of the building. What she found only deepened her sense of dread. The building had been constructed during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, and it had served as a makeshift hospital for wounded soldiers. Many had died within its walls, their spirits restless and vengeful. After the war, the building had been converted into apartments, but the hauntings had continued. Tenants reported strange noises, sudden drops in temperature, and sightings of ghostly figures. Several people had even taken their own lives, driven mad by the relentless torment of the spirits. As Rachel read through the accounts, she began to see a pattern. The hauntings were most intense on the 4th floor, where she lived. The stories were chillingly similar to her own experiences: unexplained noises, phantom knocks, and the feeling of being watched. The more she read, the more she realized that she was not alone in her suffering. But there was one account that stood out from the rest. It was a story of a man who had lived in the apartment directly above hers, on the 9th floor. He had reported the same disturbances, whispers, knocks, and shadowy figures, but his story ended differently. One night, during the ghost festival, he had performed a ritual to banish the spirits. He had burned incense, offered food, and recited prayers, hoping to appease the restless souls. The next morning, he was found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was never determined, but those who knew him believed that he had angered the spirits by trying to banish them. Rachel felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She realized that the shrine in her apartment was likely left by a previous tenant as a means of protection. But now that she had disturbed it, she feared that she had unleashed something far worse. That night, Rachel decided to perform the ritual herself, hoping to calm the spirits that haunted her. She gathered incense, food, and paper offerings, just as she had seen during the festival. She set up the offerings before the shrine, lit the incense, and began reciting the prayers she had found in her research. As she chanted, the air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow darker. The whispers returned, louder this time, their voices mingling with her own. Rachel's hands shook as she continued the ritual, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, the door to her apartment flew open with a loud bang. The force of it sent a gust of wind through the room, scattering the offerings and extinguishing the incense. Rachel screamed, dropping the paper offerings as she stumbled backward. The shadows in the room coalesced into a dark figure, its form indistinct, but terrifyingly real. It moved toward her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Rachel backed away, her mind racing as she searched for a way to escape. But the figure was too fast, closing the distance between them in an instant. It reached out, its hand passing through her chest as if she were made of air. Rachel gasped, her body freezing in place as a wave of cold washed over her. The figure's touch was like ice, sapping the warmth from her body and filling her with a deep, paralyzing fear. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the figure's face, twisted into a grotesque smile. Chapter 4: The Disappearance. Rachel awoke to the sound of her phone ringing. She was lying on the floor of her apartment, her body aching and cold. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up, her heart racing. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. The shrine in the corner was undisturbed, the offerings scattered across the floor. There was no sign of the dark figure, but the memory of its presence lingered, like a shadow in the back of her mind. She grabbed her phone and saw that it was her friend Emily calling. Emily was the only person Rachel had confided in about the strange occurrences in her apartment. She had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to stress, but as the events grew more intense, even Emily had begun to worry. "Rachel, are you okay?" Emily's voice was filled with concern. "I've been trying to reach you all day." Rachel looked at the time and realized with a shock that it was already late afternoon. She had been unconscious for hours. "I'm fine," Rachel said, her voice shaking. I don't know what happened. Are you still at the apartment? Do you want me to come over?" Emily asked. Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to drag her friend into this nightmare, but at the same time, she was terrified of being alone. "Yes, please," Rachel said. "I don't want to be here by myself." "I'll be there as soon as I can," Emily promised. Rachel hung up and tried to collect herself. She needed to get out of the apartment, to get some fresh air and clear her mind. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but as she reached for the doorknob, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The thought of leaving the apartment filled her with an inexplicable dread, as if something was preventing her from leaving. She forced herself to open the door, but as soon as she stepped into the hallway, the walls seemed to close in around her. The air was thick and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Rachel stumbled back into the apartment, her breathing shallow and panicked. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her body shaking. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't leave. When Emily arrived, Rachel was huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Emily took one look at her friend's pale, drawn face, and knew something was seriously wrong. "Rachel, what happened?" Emily asked, sitting beside her. "I don't know," Rachel whispered. "I tried to leave, but I couldn't. It's like something is keeping me here." Emily's expression grew serious. "You need to get out of this apartment. Whatever is going on here, it's not safe." Rachel nodded, but she knew it wasn't that simple. The fear that had taken hold of her was more than just psychological. It was something deeper, something that reached into her very soul. "I'll help you pack your things," Emily said. "You can stay at my place until we figure this out." Rachel agreed, but as they began packing her belongings, the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped, as if the building itself was reacting to their presence. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the living room. Both women froze, their eyes wide with fear. Emily grabbed a flashlight from her bag and slowly made her way to the source of the noise. The shrine had been knocked over, the statue lying broken on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of incense, even though none had been lit. Emily turned to Rachel, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now?" But as they headed for the door, the temperature dropped even further, their breath visible in the freezing air. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Rachel felt a cold hand on her shoulder and screamed, but when she turned around, there was no one there. The shadows moved, shifting and twisting as if they were alive. "Run!" Emily shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her toward the door. But before they could reach it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, as if the spirits were angry. Rachel felt a crushing weight on her chest, and she fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Emily tried to help her up, but she too was struggling to breathe, the air thick with an unseen force. The last thing Rachel saw before she blacked out was the dark figure standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. When Rachel awoke, she was lying in a hospital bed, her body weak and drained. Emily was sitting beside her, her face etched with worry. "What happened?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emily hesitated before answering. "I don't know," We both blacked out, and when I woke up, you were unconscious. I called an ambulance, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong with you." Rachel closed her eyes, the memory of the dark figure still fresh in her mind. "It's the apartment. There's something evil there." Emily nodded. "I believe you. We need to get you out of there for good." But when they returned to the apartment to retrieve Rachel's belongings, they found that the door had been forced open, and the entire place had been ransacked. The shrine was gone, and there were strange symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like blood. Rachel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "We need to leave. Now?" They didn't take any chances, packing up whatever they could and leaving the apartment as quickly as possible. Rachel moved in with Emily temporarily, but the events of the past few days continued to haunt her. She began having nightmares, dark, twisted visions of the dark figure that had tormented her in the apartment. The dreams were so vivid that she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily tried to comfort her, but Rachel could see the fear in her friend's eyes. They both knew that something had followed them from the apartment, something that wasn't ready to let go. As the days passed, the nightmares grew worse. Rachel began to see the dark figure even in her waking hours, a shadow lurking at the edge of her vision. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, a product of the trauma she had experienced, but deep down, she knew the truth. The spirits from the apartment had latched onto her, and they weren't going to let go. The ritual she had performed had only angered them, and now they were determined to make her pay. Epilogue: The Return. Rachel eventually moved out of Hong Kong, hoping that putting distance between herself and the city would bring her some peace. But no matter where she went, the shadows followed. She could feel them watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nightmares continued, and with each one, the dark figure grew stronger, more real. Rachel knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught up with her. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a familiar sound, a knock at the door. Her heart froze, and she turned to see the dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Rachel knew that there was no escape. The spirits had finally come for her, and this time, there was no way out. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the twisted smile of the dark figure, and she knew that her nightmare had only just begun. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.